Stanford University.
It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Prudence Carter became a sociologist quite by accident. As an undergraduate, she was an applied mathematics and economics major and had never even taken a sociology course. Her current research investigates how racial ideology, culture, and social boundaries interact and influence student behaviors in different national and urban school contexts. Her recent book, Keeping It Real, School Success Beyond Black and White, has won numerous awards, including the Oliver Cromwell Cox Book Award for its contribution to the eradication of racism. Please join me in welcoming Professor Prudence Carter.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your coming out on this very lovely afternoon. And I'd like to thank the Alumni Office for giving me the opportunity to talk to Stanford alumni. It's always a pleasure to talk to Stanford students in general in my classes for every quarter. And this is my second year at Stanford. Actually, it's the beginning of my third year at Stanford, and it's my first time participating in a reunion homecoming. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about an issue that is quite central, I think, to the societal development of many democratic nations, and particularly two countries where I have done most of my research, and that is in the United States, as well as South Africa, which is a relatively young democracy, some 15 years ago, when apartheid was dismantled by the local government and certainly by the rise of the power of an African National Congress. That country was put back on the global scene as one of the countries to watch in terms of how it would ameliorate and redress past injustices that pertain to race. And so I'm asking a very provocative question today, and I think it's provocative because, one, I've heard colleagues say that no one cares about racial integration in schools anymore. This is not an issue of integration. Rather, we're talking about school choice, and that in our American society, there are a number of tensions between what we call personal interest in the public good. What is right for the public good in a democracy? And can we impose the will of some on the will of all? And so this question that is on the agenda today is whether or not we can even go back to an issue that was raised in the early part of the 20th century to redress and to address past injustices and inequality in the academic domain, particularly when it came to incorporating African Americans, the descendants of slaves in American society. Here's a quote I'd like to share with you, and I think that it had a lot of prescience. This quote was made by the former scholar and one of the earliest 20th century sociologists, W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was a question that was raised about whether or not we should even engage in integrating American schools. There was quite a bit of debate among historians and social scientists in the early 20th century about this project we call integration. And I quote Du Bois, "The Negro needs neither segregated nor mixed schools. What he needs is education. What he must remember is that there is no magic either in mixed or in segregated schools. A mixed school with poor and unsympathetic teachers, with hostile opinion and no teaching concerning Black folk is bad. A segregated school with ignorant placeholders, inadequate equipment, poor salaries, and wretched housing is equally bad. Other things being equal, the mixed school is broader, more natural basis for the education of all youth. It gives wider contacts, it inspires greater self-confidence, and it suppresses the inferiority complex. But other things are seldom equal." That is the end of quote. What Professor Du Bois at the time was trying to suggest, and are two things that I want to suggest and want to talk about today, is that as we embarked on the project of integrating American schools, on the one hand, we want to think about the material redistribution of resources, right, in this country. But on the other hand, there are other logics that actually control our schools and have an impact and influence on students' lives, and those things are more intangible and harder to measure, but they may very well have an impact on how students actually perform, on how students will actually engage, and how attached they will come to school. And I want to talk to you this afternoon about some research that I've conducted in 8 schools between this nation and in South Africa about those various things, contending with both the material and what I call the sociocultural logic of schooling in American and South African societies. But the first thing I want to do is to ask this question: why do we care about inclusive education? Why should we care about inclusive education? As some have argued, particularly as they've studied the incorporation of special education groups in our society and in schools, inclusive education is not just about integration. It's not concerned with the assimilation or accommodation of groups. And in many ways, that's what we've thought. The absorption of marginalized populations is what it means to integrate people. It's not about integrating or assimilating those individuals with existing socioeconomic conditions and relations. It's not about making them as normal as possible, says Lynn Barton, nor is it about the well-being of a particular oppressed or excluded group. But rather, inclusive education is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end, the creation and maintenance of an inclusive society. As such, the interest is with all citizens, their well-being and security. It is ultimately about the transformation of a society and its formal institutional arrangements, such as education. This means change in the values, the priorities, and policies that support and perpetuate practices of exclusion and discrimination. So for many, this is why we actually care about this, as we're thinking about the development of a country, the transformation of a country from one that has historically excluded certain segments of society and are now trying to incorporate those members of society. There are various conduits that we use, and one of the major institutions in any society is its educational system. And so how is it that we utilize our schools to actually help and enable us to reach that next transformative moment or point? So in the United States right now, this is contemporary times, we are nearly 6 decades into the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, which was ruled by the Supreme Court. And yet, here's what our national schools portrait is about. Overall, American public schools are comprised of more than 42% racial and ethnic minority students, who make up about 1/3 of the American population. However, most white students do not attend schools with Blacks and Latinos, and 43% of white students have less than 10% minority in their schools overall. This is nationally. In contrast, more than 1/3 of Black and Latino students attend schools with an enrollment that is more than 90%, that is either equal to or greater than 90% of a minority enrollment. And one of the reasons many social scientists argue that this is also a critical issue is because it is highly correlated with material resources. If we look at our wealthiest schools in American society, many of them spend as much as or more than 10 times as much as the poorest schools in our country per capita. That's a huge disparity in terms of economic resources. So the question then becomes, given how resources are distributed in our society, and given what the courts have done over the last 6 decades or 5.5 decades, whether or not racial integration is actually a goal that can be attained in the United States. Since the Brown decision in 1954 and the subsequent Brown II decision, most of us don't even know that, in 1955, the lawyers had to go back to the Supreme Court to get the Brown decision implemented, because many districts around the country were very resistant to the Brown decision. So Brown II entailed a decision by the courts that about implementation with all deliberate speed. Multiple court cases have ensued since those 2 cases in the 1950s that have really undermined the spread of racial and ethnic integration in American schools right now. The 1974 Milligan versus Bradley case in the Midwest and the Detroit metropolitan area actually limited the court's role to impose interdistrict desegregation. So many school districts decided that they were going to engage in busing across district lines. Well, that upset a number of communities. There were court cases that ensued, and in 1974, one of the most impactful cases was ruled upon in the courts. This limited the role of districts to be forced to do interdistrict interdistrict shifting of students across interdistrict lines, rather. Then there was a case in San Antonio in 1973 that ruled, that was brought about a family called Rodriguez around inequities in school funding. And the courts ruled there that actually inequities in school funding do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of our Constitution. So these are cases, as Erwin Chemerinsky, who's a legal scholar here in this country, has talked about these different cases that have actually systematically help undermine the overall agenda of the Brown cases. And then just recently in 2005, as you may know, the Supreme Court has ruled on the Seattle and Louisville cases. These are called the PICS cases, Parents Involved in Community Schools, and they refer to these two cases collectively, which actually ruled that the racial balance assignment processes in these two cities were unconstitutional because they were actually encroaching on the constitutional rights of particular children, particularly white children who were not allowed to go into certain schools because they would disrupt the racial balance of the schools. In addition to these court cases that have been ruled, another one could argue challenge that has been posed to the idea of racial integration in American society is just this correlation with residential segregation. Where we live in our communities has a big impact on what our schools look like demographically. And we do know that since the courts ruled in 1954 and certainly in the 1960s and 70s, we've seen widespread demographic changes in where people are moving out of center cities into suburbs and away from the urban school districts, which also helps to explain why we see the kind of makeup we see nationally in urban school districts versus suburban districts. Today, folks, I'd like to share with you, and I actually didn't learn this until about a year ago, there are only 8 programs nationally in our country, 8 cities in the country that actually formally practice desegregation in American education. And those 8 districts are here. Some of them actually started as early as the mid-60s, and the most recently one was implemented in Minneapolis. And in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to Minneapolis to talk to teachers about their program, because what happens, even as schools are trying to engage in multiracial schooling and desegregation, we still have problems that ensue within the boundaries of those school contexts. And I would argue that this is probably one of the concerns for many parents and communities that decide to practice or engage in racial integration or multiracial schooling. One, we see that there are wide gaps in the academic performances of the groups within those various communities. And within many high-performing schools, we see that a number of African American and Latino students, while they may perform better than their peers in segregated schools in urban districts, more urban districts, they're still not doing as well as their counterparts within these schools. And there is a lot of angst among families and communities about whether or not it's a good thing even to have these kids in their classrooms. But the evidence is quite mixed, however, on whether or not it's having an impact. What we do know from a National Academy of Education report is that desegregation has no deleterious effect on the performance of white students whatsoever. We have not seen any studies across the nation that shows that it has a negative impact. What we have seen is that it does have a positive impact on some groups of students who move into those particular communities, but it's not a consistent a pattern, and so that's why the evidence is mixed. We also understand from some of the research that even though we do have districts like the 8 I've talked about, in addition to other schools that don't have formal desegregation programs, that there are some problems that exist in terms of how these racial and ethnic minority students are engaged or incorporated in the schools. One of the things that we see is that those students are concentrated more in lower track classes. And often that's corresponded, according to educational research, with being in classes with teachers who are not quite as qualified. And much of the research that's been ethnographic has shown that the curricula differ across these different classes for these kids. There are types of expectations that tend to be lower that follow these children as well, and I'll talk to you about the study that I'm doing, which has actually confirmed and corroborated a number of those findings. So you may ask, well, why are you looking at the United States and South Africa in terms of thinking about these questions about racial and ethnic integration in schooling? And one of the reasons I chose this from a macro perspective is that just the convergence in histories of these two countries. First of all, they're very similar in origins in terms of the dominant racial groups and the kinds of economic conditions that help shape those societies. in their beginnings, so that you had the subordination of indigenous groups in both countries, imported slavery. These were macro historical and economic conditions that helped to shape how those countries came to be what they are today. Where they also have they have actually flipped racial ethnic orders, but really interesting convergence. In South Africa, of course, we had apartheid and de jure segregation and discrimination by a very small minority of the population. About 10% of the of the population in that country is European origins, as opposed to the United States, where we had slavery, Jim Crow, de jure segregation, but that is the majority of the country. And actually in South Africa, about 10% of their population is white, about 79% of their country is black, and then in between you have blacks and coloreds and Asians, whereas in our country the demographics look very different, right? So that this made for, in terms of the demographics, a very interesting comparison. So just looking at who the numerical groups are, but also from a macro level in terms of discourse in the both countries. The discourse and educational policy in the US and South Africa vary. They're similar in some ways, but they are also very different. In South Africa, there's a lot of language about radical inclusion, non-racialism. In that country, in fact, they have done away with every form of tracking that you can think about in schools. All students take the same classes, as opposed to our country, which is much more multi-tiered and multi-leveled. There is a standardized national curriculum that all high school students take, as opposed to our country, which is decentralized, and every state actually develops its own accountability test and for graduation purposes and such. So you have these two countries which have some similar historical and social conditions, economic conditions, but they also have different approaches to education. So what might we see differently between the two? The other thing I want to share with you, I've just given you some of the American some of the history on the American case. But South Africa is also interesting because its desegregation project is not as entangled with class as it is in our country. In South Africa, most of desegregation happens among the middle class. And the reason that happens is because their students must pay a fee to go to school. We base our educational system on property taxes. And where you live actually determines the kinds of resources you often have for your school. Their property tax system is not like ours. So that what happens is stratification is enabled in that country based on who can pay the highest fees. And the highest fee schools tend to be the most desegregated schools in South Africa, interestingly enough. And so the African as well as white, colored, and Asian middle class are the ones who are engaging in this process of desegregation. Still, the percentage of white students who remain in those schools continues to decline for the last 15 years as the country has opened up. So here are some conceptual issues that I deal with in my own work that I argue have been overlooked in integration policies. And I argue that the project of integration is failing and has not been fully attained or realized for a number of reasons. One is that we've concentrated so much on moving bodies around the material resources that we've thought less about rules, codes, ideology, and the substance of relationships within these schools. How do we actually dissolve or ameliorate or thin out the boundaries that are pre-existent, that form in communities that are historically embedded, that we've actually never paid enough attention to in some ways? That's one of the issues that I argue. So that if we haven't paid attention to that in terms of policy implementation, we also are not paying attention to the kinds of resistance that may entail, or other more subtle forms of segregation that can occur within schools. School actors reproduce social and symbolic boundaries. Sociologists talk about boundaries. We talk about two types. Social boundaries are those really objectified markers of difference that we use. We use religion, ethnicity, race, class, gender. Those are social boundaries we talk about. But in addition, we also have symbolic boundaries. These are kinds of resources, rules, status, all kinds of different kinds of intangibles that we use to kind of separate the us from the them. Ways we organize ourselves in classrooms and such. And so one of the things that we find as we go deeper into the schools in our research is that we're continually reproducing these boundaries, and consequently they are counteracting the entire effort for integration in American schooling, as well in South Africa. Another issue that I argue that has been overlooked is that real integration entails a type of multicultural navigation. And what I argue in this work is that the progress of schools is stunted when students and educators and parents, one could argue, remain either cognitively rigid-minded, that means the unyielding commitment to the mutual exclusivity of others, and do not think about what some would call, cultural flexibility. The idea that all of us need to develop a propensity to move across different academic, social, and cultural spheres of schooling and life. How do we do that? How do we come about that? And I draw on this idea from a sociologist named Eviatar Zerubbabel, who writes about the logic of the flexible mind. In order for a democracy to fully develop itself, people need to be willing to move across different kinds of boundaries, whether it's ideologically or considerate. You don't necessarily have to just fully subscribe to it, but you have to be willing to consider that there can be a coexistence of various ways of life and perspectives and such, and be flexible in our thinking about it. But what, unfortunately, he says, is that many of us have remained cognitively rigid-minded about how life should be, how academics should be, how we should live, how we should subscribe. And these things, one can argue, and I'm arguing, have really fundamentally undermined the integration project. Another thing that I consider in this research, as I've spent the last 4 years in schools across these two countries, is that the organizational processes in school actually influence how culturally flexible we can be. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But first, let me just describe the schools just briefly. There are 4 schools in each country that I have done work with my research team of 6 graduate students. And I started this project when I was an assistant professor at Harvard University. 2 of these schools are in a north capital city. I use pseudonyms to protect their identity. 2 of these schools are in a southern capital city. All 4 of these schools are high-performing schools, what we call so-called good schools based on their national report cards. They're comprehensive high schools with some variation of Asian, Black, Latino, and white students. And you'll see that 2 of the schools are majority minority, meaning they're either predominantly Black and or Latino, and 2 of the schools are predominantly white, which means that they're predominantly white. And then there are 4 South African schools in the country. They're in counterpart cities, one in the Cape Town metropolitan area, which is about the same size as the north capital city that's here in the US. And then there are 2 in what I call Letisi, which is outside the Johannesburg metropolitan area. 2 of these schools are former all-white schools. These are the desegregated schools, Palmer and Williston. And these schools are all solidly middle-class schools as well, do quite well. They charge different fees. You see one charge as much as $1,000 US. This is in 2004 dollars when I conducted the research, and one about 550. Now, this is a lot of money in South Africa at that time, as opposed to the township schools, which are pretty good schools for their local context, which charge $51 and $36 per annum. So it's a big difference in terms of the class representation of the students. But you can see, more importantly, what the social composition of in the schools. In these 2 desegregated schools here, you see more of a variation. And you see that white students are actually overrepresented as 10% of the population. They're actually a third or more in each schools. And then you see there is some variation of Black, colored, and Indian, which are the 3 other formal national racial categories in the country. Let me just talk about the results from this study and how it has informed my thinking. First observation, I should say that this study was conducted using surveys. So we surveyed over 1,600 students. We also spent every day for about 6 months in these high schools going back to class. And I went back to class as a 30-something-year-old every day in 8 schools, and was flying all about. And my research assistants as well. And so I'm going to share with you some of the ethnographic findings, because I found these to be very interesting. Students learn their lines, their places, their boundaries from the real distinctions they see mirrored in the school organization, from adults and from their communities. Here's an example, learning their lines. This is a student at South County Prep, which is one of the schools here in the United States. Ashley is an 11th grade female who tells us explicitly, and this is just an exemplar, we have lots of quotes like this. We have like kind of a blurry lines a lot of the times. You know, you have that group you can't really relate to. And you can individually, so she makes a distinction between being a person versus being a member of a collective identity, but not as a whole group. And a lot of the groups, they've just learned their lines a lot. Like we have a lot of people that are in the AP classes and they hang out together a lot, and then there are the theater groups and stuff like that, and they hang out, and just like random small groups from being different, just from being high school together for so long and stuff like that. End of quote. And what Ashley is actually suggesting to us, and we heard repeatedly from our students, is that there is very little vigilance about the extent to which we succumb to human nature, if you will. And just basically birds of a feather flock together. So that within these so-called integrated contexts, and I put them in quotes, what we do is to redeploy various conditions or various ways of being that we see in our respective communities, and we learn our lines, and we practice the very same things within those schools. So that when you hear from the students who are coming across the spatial boundaries, the poor Black and Latino students who are moving into those schools, they talk about explicitly what it means to be an outsider in those groups. And we have lots of data from students talking about those kinds of things, the feeling not like they're attached or engaged. And our research, as we're doing the quantitative analysis now, is showing that the students, the less attached they feel to the school, the less well they do in school. That there is a positive correlation between attachment to a place and the achievement in the place. And I didn't want to give a statistical analysis talk today because I thought I'd have to explain betas and significant correlations and stuff. So I'm just going to talk to you about those findings a little bit. Observation number 2, schools' cultural gatekeepers reinforce these boundaries, and consequently their stance on integration through the reinforcement of explicit patterns, rules, codes, and policies. Here are some stories that I will tell you. We saw various approaches to how students were dealt with in these school contexts. One, there is the cultural difference approach, we would argue, and I'm borrowing from the work of Linda Chisholm, who is a South African policy scholar who writes about the ideological stances that school leadership can take and how they approach different groups coming into a school context. And this is, you can just acquiesce that they're there, but don't pay any attention to the full integration of those students. So South County High School is one of our schools. And this was, I actually became quite incredulous when I would actually interview teachers and students. And there were 232 African-American students in this school out of over 1,100 students, and only 2 of them were deemed as high achieving. There was something quite wrong with that pattern if we presume that there is much more normal distribution of natural talent across groups and peoples, but only 2 could be identified as high-achieving students. There was no attention in this school to the academic, spatial, and extracurricular boundaries. So for example, students in this school would talk about who belonged in baseball versus football versus the cheerleading versus the gospel choir, so that they were starting to racialize and ethnicize specific spots and places in school. That's contrary, a counter to the integration project, I would argue to you. And finally, our survey data shows us that the Black students in this school had the lowest forms of cultural flexibility using the scales that we use, and they had the lowest self-esteem. Williston High School in South Africa was a similar kind of school context we found. And in fact, but while this school actually did it more in terms of where students were taking classes and what kinds of activities they were participating in, Williston High School chose a different route because they don't have tracking. On the other hand, we did see that netball was for colored students, rugby was for white students, soccer was for the African students. They also racialized things, but they also had on the book explicit cultural codes that were ethno-racial in their orientation. So the first time I visited this school in 2001, a group of African girls came up to me and said, "Miss, can you help us?" Help you do what? I'm a foreign observer coming to the school, and they said to me, "We would like to be able to wear our hair like yours." And I said, "Well, why can't you?" And they said, "Because it's illegal in our school, ma'am." And so I interviewed the principal about this issue because I was curious about it. Here I was, Harvard University professor at the time, and I was breaking the school law, the school code. And I asked her, why was it? And she said, no braids, no twist, and no locks. well, what is it about that that was problematic? And her quote to me was that it was not normal. It was too fancy, and that they could do that on the weekend because they were trying to prepare these young people to be a part of the South African economy. Now, mind you, in the United States, we had these very same issues in the 1970s, flight attendants, there were court cases about this and stuff. But these were the kinds of cultural lines and boundaries that were being drawn among these schools in South Africa. And there are a number of studies. On the other hand, we have places like, coming back to the United States, one of my high schools, very affluent high school, that for 40 years has been participating in a formal desegregation program. And this program brings in about 150 kids from the North Capital City region each year. And one of the things that was very striking about this school is that they sent kids all over the world each year to do various cultural activities, Model UN. They would also go to Latin America for Spanish. They would go to Europe for the chorus. They sent about 100 students to Japan the year we were doing this research, which was last year. And none of the voluntary desegregated program kids participated in these activities. So this was another school like South County High School where we saw low levels of cultural flexibility among the Black and Latino students who were participating in that school. And we were trying to understand why it is that their peers in the segregated schools showed higher levels of cultural flexibility. And what we were able to conclude was based on the activities they participated in, things that actually facilitate broadening your cultural horizons. Those students in the majority minority schools were actually participating at a greater deal than the ones in the so-called good schools or the more material-rich schools. But there was a school in the study, which is Palmer High School, that actually paid quite a bit of attention to the threats of inequality through these boundaries. And so they actually, unlike Williston High School, which was a few hundred miles north, they discontinued any kind of hair and language policy that would actually exclude their ethnic minorities and racial minorities in the school. They also, when I started visiting this school in 2004, they had started a program where they sent their groups of students on an overnight retreat for 2 to 3 nights per annum. And at that time, there was one group going a year. By last August, when I was back there, they had 7 groups going per year to actually talk about these issues across difference. They were trying to dissolve the boundaries in this school. This school had the highest level of cultural flexibility of the 1,600 kids in the study. They scored the highest on here. So the main U.S. findings from the work that I've been doing is that Black students' cultural flexibility varied by the school type and their self-esteem. And as I've said, it was those in the more affluent schools who showed the lower cultural flexibility than the peers in the majority minority schools. And that was a problem. When it came for our white students in the sample, it was actually a regional effect we found. Those in the Northeast showed higher levels of cultural flexibility than those in the Southern schools. We also found that the students in the honors and AP classes showed higher levels of cultural flexibility than those in the non-AP classes. The same held for African American students actually, but where African American students were more likely to be in AP and honors classes were in majority minority schools and not the so-called good schools that are occurring. The main comparative U.S. findings, on the other hand, are very different. While those different, I've talked about the differences in the policy context and how they approached integration and tracking and inequality in schools, we saw still, despite those differences, some convergences, as I've described to you in the data, on what was happening. In some schools, it's just the policies aim to include, but local practices and actors counteract that because they just hadn't been convinced yet that the other mattered. Second, the judicial and constitutional mandates don't necessarily mesh with what people really believe about the other. And we found that continually as you think about the not normal, or what's respectful, or what's competent, or what's intelligent. And so while they had eradicated the higher grades in exams and the tracking in South Africa, you still had at the micro level students reporting high levels of disengagement or feeling quite detached from the school setting because of these various codes and policies. We also saw that in both nations, while they varied on the incorporation of their students, it depended on the ideological tone set by the school leadership. So that those who took a more radical egalitarian tone actually had students who were healthier, who were happier, who scored higher on our scales, and those who took more of an, they're here, we have to acquiesce because that's what policy says. Those students show lower levels of cultural flexibility and lower levels of global academic self-esteem. So the other thing that we notice is for U.S. school leaders, really the ideology varied around where students were located and the types of classes they were taking, the kinds of extracurricular activities. Whereas for South Africa, because that was absent, they don't have policies that allow that, we found that it relied more on specific ethno-racial cultural codes like language and hair, et cetera, et cetera. We don't see that as much in the US, and that's because of the qualitative differences in how the countries are made up. Other conclusions that we've drawn from these studies is that desegregation in some mixed race schools really do create permeable boundaries just by the mere fact that students are moving across physically, right? And they're getting access to more material and educational resources. But these projects also, these projects facilitate the diffusion of practices, but generally it's tilted a one way. And if we go back to the Barden quote, what we were finding is the students continually complaining about being forced to acculturate or assimilate. And integration, as many have envisioned it in the project, is not necessarily about that. That's assimilation. That is not integration. And so that is one of the things that students continually talked about in this study. And finally, as I've said, the organization of those students will have some impact on whether or not they even have a proclivity or a comfort level in moving across the various boundaries. So I'm going to leave you with two critical policy questions. Yes?
Just on the previous slide, I didn't get it about the desegregation having been somewhat useful or successful, but that it's considered to be asymmetric or one way. I just didn't.
You didn't get that? Oh, yeah. What I was saying is, and I didn't give you a lot of data on this because I'm mindful of time, is that when students actually came into the schools, I mentioned the Williston High School, for example, in order to fit into the school, you must accommodate and acculturate so that it was a one-way direction. And I will tell you a story. So I mentioned the hair policy, and it seems quite frivolous to us, but it actually is fraught with a lot of political signification because there were actually young white girls who actually wanted to wear their hair. They'd come on a Caribbean vacation or something. And there was in one of the Johannesburg papers, for example, she had come to school with the Bo Derek, like you remember 10, and the Bo Derek like cornrow braids, and she was sent home. And it was written about in the national newspaper. And one of the arguments is that there is this fear that if it was two-way, that the cultural practices were going both ways, it would rub off the wrong way. And so those are the kinds, that's what I mean by a one-way or tilted or asymmetric cultural practices. It was okay for the African or the racial and ethnic minority kids in this country to behave or act or partake in a certain way, but it is not okay for cultural practices to go the other way. That's what I mean by that. And so the critical policy questions on the question, and I return to the question I started at, is racial education integration a dead school issue? Is because right now, because of the withdrawal and the retreat from the project since the middle of the 20th century, and because of the way the demographics work right now, and because of the issues that are emerging even within multiracial desegregated contexts, people have now been asked, should we aim for a well-implemented Plessy rather than a feebly implemented post-Seattle and Louisville Brown? What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the ultimate goal now to go back to a truly separate but equal academic educational context, given how our schools look demographically and how they will be changing even more in the 21st century. We have resegregated. In fact, the level of segregation may be even greater today than it was in the 1970s post the implementation of Brown. Rather than a feebly implemented, and what I've been describing is some of the challenges of those schools that have actually been trying to integrate, but also have had forms of segregation emerge within their respective school contexts. And a second critical policy question that has emerged is how do we get traction on the broader educational issues that construct the real opportunities for young people in schools, which determine their futures and our nation's future? Because dare I say that this was really one of the main impetus behind even thinking about why we needed integration in American society. And so I want to leave you with those questions, and hopefully that we can discuss it. And I thank you for listening to me today. Thank you. Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I went to a school that was more than 99.8% white, and we had our exclusive groups with their norms and their subcultures, and it was extremely difficult to crack into those if you were an outsider, as I was. What prospect do you see for re-indoctrinating high school children to be more tolerant?
That's a very good question. Children actually do, what processes that I see, I actually don't think that the processes from schools are disentangled from the processes of home and community. And in fact, the reason that I asked this question about whether or not it's a dead issue is because they're so deeply entangled, what's happening in our communities in terms of housing, in terms of family formations and such, that I think that it's going to have to happen simultaneously. But there are many who have argued that, well, actually, that is actually the point of education. Education is historically supposed to have been the vehicle for equalizing opportunity in American society. And if we can't intervene with our children in an institution where they spend so many hours of their lives and where a lot of their socialization occurs, where can we do it? And so the question is not, yes, stratification handles boundaries happen all the time. And it's not to say that all boundaries are inherently bad, because youth actually we know from adolescent research, they develop cliques. They develop boundaries. What we're concerned with is, and what I'm concerned with as an educational researcher, is when those boundaries actually undermine the academic engagement of an entire population of kids. And that's the problem, is that within these contexts, and in some counties in the country, in fact, we're seeing wider academic achievement gaps within these so-called good schools than we're seeing in urban schools that don't have as many resources. And that's an anomaly. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of antithetical to the project of integration. And we have to ask why. So that when we go into the schools...
There were these cliques in my one-race school, which depressed the academic achievement of the members.
Right. So I don't deny, and I certainly don't want to disavow, that students, even in one-race schools, we have these similar issues. Stratification is stratification. So whether it's an homogeneous school racially or it's interracial, but the issue here is, what I'm suggesting is, if it's a multiracial school, the patterns shouldn't look so much, they shouldn't be raced. The pattern should be more like what you're talking about. It'd be more distributed, normally distributed across different types of cliques, as opposed to it being distributed across race and ethnicity, right? That's what's problematic for us. It's kind of like if you went into a school and all the boys were just doing fine and the girls weren't doing fine. You know, they still have their cliques. That's a problem. So when we think about that in math and science, right? Why is it that we see, well, although increasingly girls are doing very well in math and science, it wasn't that way some 20 years ago. But so that is the problem in American society in this age of accountability, when we're comparing our growth and our performance to other industrial countries, and we're thinking about why the United States is scoring so low on international tests, we're starting to look inward within our schools, and we're seeing these racial patterns that suppress and depress a lot of our results. And why is it that those things are happening? And they're not happening in all schools. Some schools are doing very well, and some schools are not doing so well. And that is the question. So we thought that integration was the way to bring up scores, to bring up achievement. And what's really happening is that we've actually not fully attained integration, even within the schools where the kids are spatially proximate, if you will. So, but it's not to disavow the fact that even within schools that are homogenous, I mean, even in an all Black or Latino or Asian school, you'll see certain patterns like that. That certainly happens, yeah. Yes?
I find myself wondering, if you have a group of public schools, how are you sure that the stratification or the different kinds of your divisions that you're seeing are having to do with race as opposed to a whole bunch of other socioeconomic factors?
So that's a very good question. In our study, we controlled for socioeconomic status to see if these results sustain themselves. So I didn't talk about the quantitative portion of it. So the cultural flexibility, I gave you the finding, but I didn't show you the actual statistical tables. We actually controlled, and what I mean by that is when we control for socioeconomic status, we enter a variable in the equation so that we can just look at all kids who share a similar socioeconomic background. So we'll compare, so do we see a race effect above and beyond accounting for class background of the kids? And so, or in the South African case where I told you almost all those kids are middle class. It's not a class issue in the South African case because these are the kids of lawyers and doctors and judges. They're African and teachers and such, and those issues were still emerging. That's how we know it's really about race in that society. In the United States case, what we did statistically was to look at parent background, right? Educational background. That's the proxy we generally use, and we entered that into the statistical data. That was actually not significant in our study. What was more significant was to see that the various groups by their racial ethnic types show varying levels of cultural flexibility. And particularly, and this is to answer your question even more, I didn't talk about the majority minority schools. These were the all black and black and Latino schools. Those kids came from similar backgrounds as many of the kids in the other schools that were majority white multiracial schools. Those kids did better. So that if it was just about class, we should have seen similarities across the same kids in the same context. That's how we know, that's what implicates that it's just more than about class.
Yeah, I guess
right.
What I don't like is that a lot of people will say that cognitive flexibility is central to intelligence. And so how much of a difference is there between cognitive flexibility and cultural flexibility? And that ends up like something that's I don't know, some impermeable label that you can't do anything about.
Well, in terms of I don't actually do cognitive flexibility, but we did integrate point average into our data, into our formula, and it was not a significant finding. What we found, though, what was significant was that the kids who were actually in the upper echelon classes did better. Now, you might think that there's a correlation, but sometimes that's not necessarily one-to-one because of the way they went.
Tracking or you mean socioeconomic?
I'm sorry, say it again?
When you say the upper echelon classes, you mean?
The tracked classes, like the AP, the IB, the honors courses, international baccalaureate courses. So we actually entered a variable into the equation to actually ascertain whether or not that had any positive or negative correlation with it. But to get to your question, in one of the schools, yes, not to disavow class, in the school that I call North Village Prep, and I'll go back to the schools if I can get them. There was this school here. There's actually a big gap between these kids and these kids in terms of their parents' educational background. The average white student's parent had an advanced degree. These children are many of the voluntary desegregation programs in the country are not really race-based, but they're more class-based, about moving poor kids across district lines so that you actually see that most of these come from poor and working class backgrounds. Class is it has a lot to do with whether or not you can even afford to go to Japan or not, right? Or if your parents can afford to do that. Meanwhile, while we know that there were some class differences, what was striking to us is that even compared to this school, where this school had a higher percentage of free and reduced lunch kids, this was a high-performing minority school. Many of these kids, these black and Latino kids, look just like these kids. They do better. That's why it was surprising to us. And similarly between these two schools. In fact, these schools are only about 10 miles apart. These kids, many of them are poorer than the black kids in this school. Many of these kids, in 93% black school, these kids, a lot more of them do better than here. The other interesting finding for us, based on the data we have about test scores, the kids in this school do really well on math. The kids here, the minority kids here, do really well in language. The same pattern was found here. And I've seen other studies where interestingly enough, the kids in the majority minority schools seem to be doing better on math, and they were doing a little bit better on language in these schools. I can't explain that, but so we see a flip. It's just a really interesting and odd pattern. And in fact, some of these kids were doing even better than the overall schools here. So my point here is that if it's about class, we should see a little bit more consistency in how they perform on those things. I hope that answered your question. Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Great, exciting stuff. Two questions really on cultural flexibility and just asking sort of a pulse check, from the expert kind of thing. And I think the first part is cultural flexibility as a value, promoting cultural flexibility as a value, and then the second part is structurally completing our addressing of cultural flexibility. And so I think on the first part, what I mean is, where are we at in dialoguing or renewing the dialogue of cultural flexibility, not assimilation, as a value to be promoted? I recall during the last resurgence of trying to get more language training in public schools, which is probably 15 years ago now,
Right.
this was suddenly how we're going to be competitive and being promoted as a value, this ability to have multiple skills to cross multiple boundaries. But I have to tell you, not being in education, I haven't heard that in the same extent maybe I did a decade ago recently.
Right.
And then the second part is drawing on some of your structural organization of it too. How many missed opportunities do we have that also send the message that it's not a value if we don't fully implement culturally flexible opportunities across the board? And coming from a health background, we just finished in Washington, D.C., where we struggled with some of these issues you might have heard. A recent set of activities with a lot of young people, and one of the topics was, activities and sensitivity and issues dealing with GLBT students, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning students. And our brilliant youth were like, well, if you really want to make things better overall, we all need to hear about the GLBTQ issues, not just having those services as an option for kids who identify with that.
Right.
And I think to me that was a great picture of, you can say we've got great flexibility, new services for people to access, but if we're not exposing the majority of our kids to that activity, we're not really bridging any gaps. So I guess just your expert pulse check on those sort of two areas.
Well, I agree with you about this. I mean, the idea of even integration is about whether or not it's a value, right? Is it valued? I mean, we've shown, the American people have spoken, really, we've spoken with our wallets and our choices in some ways. And a lot of that is because I go back to the question I started with, thinking about the tension between our own personal self-interest, our interest in our kids, and obviously how competitive they're going to be, and the fears around being with the other, as opposed to what might be good for the public, good for the democracy, for the health of this country. And so this idea about cultural flexibility as a value that everybody is exposed to, this particular school actually started to take that issue on just as we were leaving the field. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the program. It's a very Oprah-esque program called Be the Change. And Be the Change, Oprah introduced this on a show where they had gone into a Midwestern high school, huge Midwestern high school, and they spend the entire day talking about various kinds of social differences, not just the ones we think about, race, class, gender. And the students actually find out so much about each other as teachers and administrators as well as students to start to unpack this stuff collectively. So this school decided to bring that program into its school. And because they were so worried about their academic achievement gap within it, they were worried about the boundaries that were so palpable. When we would walk into the cafeteria as researchers, it was just glaring how students chose to sit. The kids talked about that repeatedly to us. Why is it that the schools themselves, why couldn't they do it? Why wasn't the system helping them? And so this school decided as a system to try to do that by trying to make it a value for the school-wide. And that goes back to my larger point. The leadership sets the milieu of whether or not it's a value or not. And in the schools where the leadership actually was attentive to it, we found that the kids were thriving in terms across the board. In the schools where the leadership did not care, or when it was just, well, it's there, but they were inattentive to it, or it's certain kids we care about, we found that kids were floundering. And so that is one of the larger points, is that the gatekeepers, the officials who really set the tone, who become the system, as the kids say, they're the ones who are going to show what the value is in the climate. And of course, that interacts with whether or not the community and the parents are supporting it or not too. So I appreciate that point about the value, but and it's not one way. It's got to be multiple ways. Thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
Aside from running a large encounter group, if I were a principal who wanted to break down these barriers and bring about inclusion, what would I do?
What would you do?
What would I do?
And besides from running an encounter group, you say, is that what you call?
By Oprah, yes.
No, actually, Oprah doesn't sponsor it. She popularized it. Yeah, so there is actually a couple of a husband and wife team who've been going across the country doing this kind of work. Excuse me. And there are a couple of things that I suggest that you do. It doesn't hurt to talk. I believe in school-wide town meetings, actually, because I think it's important to get the nasty stuff out there, or the contentious stuff out there. What I found after they had the assembly to introduce this, I actually went into a class, one of the classes here in North Village Prep. And this is my most affluent school in the study. And I went into a classroom, it was a sociology class. I cannot tell you how engaged kids became with me when they got to talk about this stuff for the first time. Because they don't get to talk about it on the day-to-day life. They talk about it among their peers. They don't necessarily have the language as the social scientists have about it, but they got to talk about it. And then the students were working in concert with the school administration team to think about what might work for them and their peers. I think one of the hardest things is we adults think, we try to do programmatic things without thinking about what's, one, age appropriate, two, what the youth themselves might need. And so as a researcher, I spent a lot of time with adolescents. I learned what they think about it. And this has been helpful for me as I've gone back to this principal just recently to tell him what they're talking about, because they don't know. Talk to your students. But the other thing is schools cannot do it devoid of assistance from other parts of the ecology of education, I would argue. And mind you, there is a lot of pressure on teachers and practitioners to solve all of American education's problems. I actually would suggest to you that it can't all be done that way. I mean, part of this is a larger housing and sociological problem that we have in our society, because we don't even have national conversations about this stuff. Our president had to be very careful about how he even talked about it if he wanted to get elected. And we don't have town hall meetings about this stuff nationally. We have town hall meetings about other things that matter, that are tangentially related to inequality when it comes to academics. But I think we have to think about housing, jobs, poverty, as well as education. Those things are very intersecting. And I'm a sociologist, so I think about these things and how they overlap and intersect. But specifically within the school, I think also educators have to pay some attention to where students are locating themselves, the kinds of classes. Do we see patterns? If we see patterns, how can we break down these patterns? How can we
Physical location.
Physical as well as academic. How can we ensure? And we have principals that say, well, they choose not to take those classes. Well, why are they not taking those classes? These classes that will lead to going to college. Why aren't they in the AP and honors classes? Why aren't they subscribing to the IB? They do in other schools. Kids just like them. Why aren't they doing it in this school? And I think those are the kinds of conversations that principals and teachers and parents could be having with kids. And what kids do is that, why is it that the baseball team looks like this? The cheerleading teams, model UN, band, orchestra look like this? It's not representative of what our school looks like. So it's about a certain type of vigilance, I would suggest to you. But to have that, you also have to be cognizant yourself. You need to be aware of yourself as the leadership. So, am I out of town? I think so. Unless there's, yeah, right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carter.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.